22 years after my mother chose my sister over me, I walked back into her hospital room uninvited. The nurse whispered my name like a warning. My sister froze at the door, blocking my path. "You lost your right to be here." I only smiled, because I was the one authorized to sign her discharge papers. "My name is Kayla, and before I tell you what happened in that hospital corridor, I need you to understand the 22 years that came before it. Because none of what I did that night was sudden. It had been building since the summer I turned 19, since the night my mother, Jasmine, stood in the doorway of our house in Ohio and told me I wasn't welcome anymore. I was the older daughter. My sister, Quinn, was 2 years younger, and from the time we were children, there was a difference in how we were treated that I didn't have language for until I was much older. Quinn got the new clothes, bought specifically for the first day of school every year, tags cut off in the car on the way home. I got the hand-me-downs, even though I was the one who actually needed them more, because I was the one who worked 2 jobs starting at 16, a bakery on weekends and a retail shift after school, just to have spending money my mother otherwise refused to provide. Quinn got praised for grades that were, honestly, average, report cards with a string of B's and C's that my mother would tape to the refrigerator like an accomplishment. I got told my straight A's weren't anything special because smart girls don't need cheering on, a line I heard so many times I could recite it in my sleep. I remember one specific afternoon, I must have been 14, when I won a regional academic competition, the kind of thing that came with an actual trophy and a small write-up in the local paper. I brought the trophy home, genuinely excited, and set it on the kitchen counter. My mother glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before asking whether I'd remembered to pick up Quinn from dance practice. The trophy sat in a closet after that. I don't know what happened to it eventually. I used to think it was in my head. I used to think I was imagining the difference, keeping score out of jealousy the way siblings sometimes do. It took me years of therapy, much later in life, to understand that I wasn't imagining anything at all. My mother had simply decided, somewhere early on, that Quinn was the daughter she was proud to show people, and I was the daughter she managed, the one whose competence she relied on without ever once acknowledging it as something worth loving. The break came the summer after my first year of nursing school. I had fallen in love with a man my mother didn't approve of, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he came from a family with less money than ours, and my mother had specific ideas about where her daughters should end up. I told her I was going to keep seeing him regardless of her opinion. She told me that if I walked out that door to see him, I shouldn't bother coming back. I thought it was one of those things parents say in anger, the kind of ultimatum that gets walked back by morning. I was wrong. When I came home 3 days later, my key didn't work. My things were in trash bags on the porch. And Quinn was standing in the window, watching, saying nothing. That relationship didn't even last 2 years. But the exile did. 22 years of it. I want to be honest about something because I think honesty matters more than a clean story. I didn't spend those 22 years pining for my mother's approval. But I also won't pretend the first stretch of it wasn't brutal. There was a period, maybe 4 months, where I genuinely didn't have a fixed place to sleep. I stayed with a coworker from the diner for a while on her couch until it started to feel like I was overstaying a kindness that had no obligation attached to it. After that, I spent close to 6 weeks sleeping in my car in the parking lot behind the diner where I worked overnight shifts, showering at a 24-hour gym I'd signed up for specifically because it had showers, not because I had any illusions about working out at 4 in the morning. I remember doing coursework for my nursing prerequisites under a street lamp because it was the only light bright enough to read by after my car battery started dying if I ran the interior light too long. I never told anyone in my family about that period, not because I was too proud, but because I understood, even then, that no one was going to ask. Denise found out years later, by accident, and cried harder about it than I ever did at the time. When you're living it, there's no room for the tears. You just move to the next shift, the next exam, the next month. Somewhere in that stretch, I made a decision that I think shaped the rest of my life more than almost anything else. I decided that I was done waiting for permission, from my mother, from anyone, to be someone. I finished my nursing degree 2 semesters behind schedule, but I finished it. I specialized in cardiac care, because something about the precision of it, the way a heart either works or it doesn't, no room for excuses, appealed to the part of me that had grown up constantly being told my effort didn't count for enough. Eventually, I worked my way into hospital administration and then into healthcare consulting, advising hospital systems on patient care protocols across 3 states. I built a life that had nothing to do with the woman who raised me. I got married to a good man named Theo, who I met during my second year of nursing school, back when I was still sleeping 4 hours a night and surviving on gas station coffee. He never once made me feel like the family I came from defined what I was worth. We had 2 kids together, a boy and a girl. My mother never met them. She chose not to know they existed, and for over 2 decades, that was simply a fact of my life, the way some people's fact is a parent who died young. Mine just chose actively to not be there. Quinn, meanwhile, stayed close. She moved 15 minutes from our mother's house. She had 2 kids of her own, and from what I could piece together through the few relatives who still spoke to me, Quinn's life orbited entirely around staying in our mother's good graces. She managed our mother's finances. She handled her medical appointments. She positioned herself deliberately and carefully as the good daughter, the reliable one, the one who never left. What I didn't know, what none of us fully understood until later, was what that positioning actually meant underneath the surface. 2 years before the night in the hospital, a cousin of mine named Denise reached out to me. We'd stayed loosely in touch over the decades, the kind of relationship that exists mostly in birthday texts and the occasional forwarded article. Denise called me on a Sunday evening, her voice lower than usual, careful in a way that immediately put me on edge. She told me something that unsettled me enough that I couldn't shake it for months. She said our mother had been quietly asking around about elder law attorneys. Not for herself exactly, for guidance on what to do about a family member handling her money in ways that felt off. Denise didn't know more than that, and I didn't push because at that point I had built enough distance from that family that I told myself it wasn't my business anymore. I remember sitting on my back porch after that call, staring at nothing in particular, feeling an old, unwelcome pull in my chest. I hated how easily it came back, the reflexive worry, the instinct to protect a woman who had thrown my belongings onto a porch in trash bags 2 decades earlier. Theo found me out there an hour later and asked what was wrong. I told him I didn't know yet. That turned out to be true for longer than either of us expected. But something in me didn't let it go. Maybe it was the nurse in me. Maybe it was some old buried part of me that still cared what happened to the woman who raised me, even after everything. Eventually, quietly, I hired a licensed financial investigator, not out of vengeance, but out of the kind of caution you learn in healthcare, where you see what happens to elderly patients who get taken advantage of by people they trust. He was careful to stay within what was legally accessible: public probate filings, county property records, and financial statements my mother later authorized him to review once she engaged Foster directly. Nothing was pulled through improper means, which mattered to me, because whatever else this became, I needed it to hold up to scrutiny. What I found over the following months was worse than I expected. Quinn had been managing our mother's accounts for almost a decade by then. Small, steady withdrawals dressed up as reimbursements. A loan for a kitchen renovation that was never repaid. Property tax payments on Quinn's own house, quietly routed through an account our mother thought was paying for her own home repairs. None of it was dramatic enough to trigger alarms on its own. That was the point. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, spread across 10 years, hidden behind Quinn's carefully maintained image as the daughter who never left. The specific details, once I had them, made my stomach turn in a way I wasn't fully prepared for. There was a stretch of 18 months where Quinn had been withdrawing exactly $4,800 a month from our mother's investment account, always categorized as care coordination, a term vague enough that no outside auditor would question it, but specific enough to look official on paper. There was a kitchen renovation at Quinn's own house. New cabinets, a marble island, the kind of upgrade that runs well into 6 figures, quietly financed through a loan from our mother that had no repayment schedule, no interest, and no documentation beyond a single handwritten note. There were property tax payments on Quinn's home, routed through an account our mother had been told was covering her own home's repairs that, as far as the investigator could tell, had never actually happened. The roof our mother believed had been fixed 2 years earlier was, according to a contractor Quinn had never actually hired, still exactly as damaged as it had always been. None of it was dramatic enough on its own to trigger alarms. That was the point. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, spread across nearly a decade, hidden behind Quinn's carefully maintained image as the daughter who never left, the one who showed up to every doctor's appointment, the one everyone in the extended family praised at holidays while I existed, if I existed at all in their conversations, as a cautionary tale about ungrateful daughters. I didn't confront anyone. I want to be clear about that, because I know how tempting it is in stories like this to imagine some big dramatic showdown at that point. That's not what happened. Instead, I did something quieter and, I think, more responsible. I reached out, not to my mother directly, since I had no relationship with her to reach through, but to an elder law attorney of my own, a man named Foster Bellamy, who specialized in cases exactly like this. I laid out everything I'd found across 3 separate meetings, bringing bank statements the investigator had legally obtained through public probate and property records, receipts, timelines. Foster listened without interrupting, took notes in a small leather notebook, and told me plainly at the end of it that without our mother's cooperation, there wasn't much that could be done. Because legally, she had the right to let her own money go wherever she chose, even if that choice was being manipulated by someone she trusted. That answer frustrated me more than I expected it to. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot outside his office afterward, gripping the steering wheel, furious at a system that could see exactly what was happening and still call its hands tied. But Foster had also said something else that stayed with me, that these situations rarely stay static. Elderly people who are being quietly taken advantage of eventually notice something, even if it takes years. He told me to be patient, and to make sure that if that moment came, I would be findable. So I waited. And I watched from a distance, as Quinn's management of our mother's life grew more complete. Our mother's health began declining around that same time. Mild cognitive changes that Quinn was suspiciously quick to describe to relatives as getting worse than it really is, which struck me professionally as exactly the kind of narrative someone builds when they want control without oversight. Then, 8 months before the hospital, everything changed in a way I never expected. I received a call from Foster Bellamy's office. My mother had contacted him directly. It turned out that my mother was not as unaware as Quinn believed her to be. Whatever else was true about Jasmine, and there was a lot that was true, a lot that I still hadn't forgiven, she was not a stupid woman. She had started noticing discrepancies herself. A missed payment here. A bank statement that didn't add up there. And in a moment I still find hard to fully process, she had asked Foster, point blank, to find out if I would be willing to speak with her. I said no the first time. I said no the second time. It took Foster explaining gently that this wasn't really about reconciliation. It was about my mother recognizing, at 78 years old, that she had made choices in her life that left her without protection, and that despite everything, I was apparently the only person she trusted enough not to have an angle. I met with her once in Foster's office, with him present the entire time, seated at the head of a long conference table like a referee. It was not a warm reunion. There were no tears, no embrace, no apology that undid 22 years. My mother looked older than I expected, smaller, her hands folded tightly in her lap the way they used to be when she was bracing for an argument. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, in a color she never used to wear, and it struck me oddly how much of her life I simply had no information about anymore. She could have had an entirely different personality in the years I'd missed, and I wouldn't have known. She didn't ask about my children. She didn't ask about Theo. She didn't ask even once what those 22 years had actually looked like for me, and part of me had almost expected that, braced for it the way you brace for weather you already know is coming. What she said instead was direct, almost clinical, the way she used to talk about household budgets when I was a child. I don't expect you to forgive me. I expect you to be competent. That's all I ever really trusted about you, even when I was cruel about it. It wasn't kindness. It was, in its own cold way, honesty. The first honest thing she had said to me in over 2 decades, and somehow that honesty landed harder than any apology could have. I sat with that sentence for a long time afterward, turning it over. She wasn't asking to be my mother again. She was asking me to be the only person in her orbit who had nothing to gain from lying to her. It was a strange kind of trust, built entirely on the absence of warmth, but it was trust nonetheless, and after 22 years of having none of her attention at all, even that felt significant. Over the following months, working entirely through Foster, My mother restructured her legal protections. She revoked the financial power of attorney Quinn had held for years. She named me instead, not as a gift, not as some emotional gesture of reconciliation, but as what she called a practical decision made by someone who has nothing to gain from lying to me. She also updated her healthcare directive, naming me as the one authorized to make medical decisions on her behalf if she couldn't make them herself, and, critically, the one authorized to sign off on things like hospital discharge, care plans, and facility placement. None of this was shared with Quinn. My mother was explicit about that. She said Quinn could not be trusted to react rationally, and given what I now understood about how carefully Quinn had built her position, I agreed completely. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters. I did not do any of this hoping for a relationship with my mother. By the time all this legal work was finished, I understood clearly that this wasn't a reunion story. My mother was not becoming warm. She was not becoming a grandmother to my children. She was, in the last years of her life, correcting a mistake in the only language she had ever really spoken fluently, the language of control, of paperwork, of who holds authority over what. I accepted that role because it was the right thing to do for a vulnerable, elderly woman being quietly financially abused by someone she trusted, not because it healed anything between us. Which brings me to the night at the hospital. My mother had a cardiac event, not fatal, but serious enough to require an overnight stay and a series of tests. Quinn, as always, was the first one there, and by the time I arrived, having been called directly by the hospital's on-call case manager per the directive on file, Quinn had already positioned herself at the door of our mother's room like a gatekeeper. I hadn't seen Quinn in over 20 years. She looked at me the way you'd look at someone who had wandered onto private property. "What are you doing here?" she said, not even really a question. I told her I'd been called. She laughed, short and sharp, and said the words that, honestly, I had half expected for years. "You didn't come for her. You came for whatever you think you're going to get out of this." Then she said it, the line that mattered. "You lost your right to be here." I didn't argue with her in the hallway. That's not who I am, and frankly, after 2 decades of estrangement, I had no interest in performing outrage for an audience of hospital staff. I simply asked to speak with the charge nurse. Within a few minutes, the nurse confirmed what Quinn didn't know. I was the listed healthcare proxy on file, the one legally authorized to review my mother's chart, speak with her physicians, and when the time came, sign her discharge paperwork. I watched something shift in Quinn's face in that moment, the exact instant the story she had told herself for a decade, the story where she was the daughter who mattered, collapsed under the weight of a single piece of paperwork she hadn't known existed. She said quieter now, "That's not possible. I handle everything for her." The nurse, professionally and without cruelty, simply said that the documentation was current and had been updated 8 months earlier. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I could have. I could have thrown 22 years of resentment back in her face in that hallway, could have told her about the street lamp in the car and the 6 weeks I spent showering at a gym just to survive nursing school while she was busy inheriting the entire architecture of our mother's trust. I didn't. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. Instead, I asked to see my mother. A hospital hallway is a strange place to have the most important confrontation of your adult life. There's a vending machine humming somewhere, a monitor beeping in a room 2 doors down, someone's family arguing quietly about parking validation. Life doesn't pause for your reckonings. It just keeps happening around you while you stand there holding 22 years in your chest. She was awake, tired, hooked to monitors, and when she saw me, she didn't perform warmth she didn't feel. She simply said, "Good. You're here." That was it. That was the whole reunion. And somehow it was enough because it was honest. Over the following 2 days, I coordinated her care. I asked her cardiologist to review a potential medication interaction I'd flagged, something her regular physician, one Quinn had chosen, notably, without much research, appeared to have missed. The care team confirmed it within the hour and adjusted the prescription before she was ever put at risk. I arranged for a follow-up care plan that actually matched what my mother needed instead of what was convenient for Quinn's schedule. Quinn tried twice to have the hospital social worker intervene, insisting there had been some mistake, that she was the one who had always handled things, that whatever paperwork I'd produced must have been coerced or forged. Both times, the documentation held, notarized and filed months before any of this became urgent, with a witness signature from someone at Foster's office who had no connection to either of us. On the second attempt, I watched Quinn's composure crack in a way I'd never seen from her growing up. She'd always been the calm one, the controlled one, and here she was, raising her voice in a hospital corridor, insisting to a patient advocate that there had to be some mistake, that she'd spent 10 years being the one who showed up. The advocate, a woman with the kind of practiced patience that comes from doing this job for a long time, quietly informed her that continued disruption could result in a formal request that she not be present during care discussions at all, a boundary hospitals are legally allowed to enforce when a listed proxy's decisions are being actively undermined. Quinn left the floor that afternoon and didn't come back until the day my mother was discharged. I remember watching her walk toward the elevator, her shoulders rigid, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of tired relief, the same relief you feel when a wound you've been carrying finally starts, however slowly, to close. The discharge itself was quiet. Understated. My mother was alert and lucid by then, well enough to have signed the paperwork herself. But the hospital's care coordinator explained that given her recent cognitive fluctuations and the active guardianship-adjacent directive on file, protocol required the listed proxy's co-signature before transfer to a step-down facility. My mother nodded when they explained it to her and looked at me and said only, "Good, that's settled then," as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. I signed the paperwork the coordinator handed me, the same paperwork Quinn had once assumed, without question, would always have her name on it instead of mine. My mother was moved to a short-term rehabilitation facility, one I selected after actually researching quality ratings and staffing levels, something I don't believe had ever been done for her before. In the weeks after, once my mother had settled into rehabilitation and her strength had started slowly to return, the full picture came out, mostly through Foster's office and a forensic accountant he brought in, a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Ambrose who spent nearly 6 weeks tracing a decade of transactions across 4 different accounts, cross-referencing dates against calendar entries, receipts, and property records until the pattern was undeniable, laid out in a document nearly 40 pages long. The final number wasn't small. Just under $200,000 had moved out of my mother's accounts over the preceding decade in ways that couldn't be explained as legitimate care expenses. My mother, upon seeing the full report laid out in black and white, made a decision I respected even though I understood how much it must have cost her. She did not pursue criminal charges against Quinn. She said flatly that she didn't have the years left to spend on a courtroom. But she did formally restructure her estate, removing Quinn as a beneficiary of anything beyond a fixed, modest amount, redirecting the rest toward a trust that would go to her grandchildren directly, including, for the first time in their lives, my own children, who she still had never met in person, but whose names she now at least knew. Quinn found out about the estate changes the way she found out about everything else in those final months, after the fact, through paperwork, through a lawyer's letter instead of a family conversation, because there was no family conversation left to have. She called me once, late on a Tuesday night, furious, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. She accused me of manipulating a dying woman for money, of swooping in after 22 years to steal what she'd spent a decade earning through actual care. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, even when it would have been easy to. Then I told her the only thing I had to say, that I had never asked for any of it, that I would have been perfectly content never speaking to our mother again for the rest of my life, and that the only reason any of this had happened at all was because our mother, for the first time I could remember, had looked clearly and honestly at which of her daughters had actually been telling her the truth. I told her that I understood if she never forgave me, and that I genuinely didn't need her to, because forgiveness had never been what I was after. I hung up before she could respond. It was the last real conversation we ever had. In the months that followed, the extended family split roughly the way you'd expect. Some relatives, the ones who had spent 2 decades repeating Quinn's version of events without ever asking me for mine, stopped speaking to me entirely, choosing loyalty to the story they'd already believed over any interest in the facts. Others, like Denise, finally understood why I disappeared from family gatherings for so long and apologized for assumptions they'd carried for years. I didn't need the apologies, but I appreciated the honesty behind them more than I expected to. I also, for the first time, brought my children to meet their grandmother. It was not the tearful, cinematic reunion you might imagine. My mother was tired by then, weakened, and the visits were short, practical, sometimes even a little awkward. But she asked my daughter about her schoolwork. She told my son once that he had my father's stubborn chin, a detail I hadn't even known was true until she said it. Small things. Not healing exactly. Just facts, finally being allowed to exist in the same room as each other. I remember driving home after that first visit, my kids quiet in the back seat, and my daughter, who was 11 at the time, asking me why I looked like I was about to cry when nothing sad had happened. I didn't have a good answer for her in the moment. It took me most of the drive to understand it myself. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was the strange grief of watching your children be treated normally, warmly even, by someone who had spent your entire childhood teaching you that warmth was something you had to earn and never quite could. I never told my kids the full story of those 22 years. I told them enough that their grandmother and I had been distant, that we were working on it, but I protected them from the specifics. The trash bags on the porch, the street lamp, the 6 weeks in my car. Some inheritances aren't meant to be passed down. I decided a long time ago that the weight of that particular one would stop with me. My mother passed 11 months later, in a facility with staff who actually knew her name, surrounded by care she had chosen instead of care that had been managed for someone else's convenience. I was there. Quinn was not by that point welcome, not because I barred her, but because our mother, in her final clear months, had made that choice herself. I didn't get a storybook ending. My mother and I never became close. We never had the kind of relationship where old wounds get spoken aloud and healed, where you sit across a table and finally say all the things you rehearsed saying for 2 decades. There was no scene like that for us. She never told me she was proud of me. Not once. Not even at the end. Some nights, if I'm honest, that still sits heavy in my chest, a door that never fully opened even when everything else did. What we had, in the end, was something smaller and, I think, more honest than a reconciliation, a recognition, finally, arriving decades too late but arriving nonetheless, of who had actually shown up with nothing to gain and who had spent a decade quietly taking. I've made peace with the fact that it wasn't love that brought her back to me. It was arithmetic. It was a woman running out of time and finally doing the math on who in her life had never once lied to her. I'll take that. It's not everything. But after 22 years of nothing, it was not nothing either. Theo asked me once, not long after the funeral, whether I regretted any of it. The investigator, the lawyer, the months of quiet, careful work I did without any guarantee it would matter to anyone but me. I told him no. I didn't do it for my mother. Not really, and I didn't do it for myself either. I did it because somewhere in a decade of hospital hallways, I had learned what it looks like when someone vulnerable gets quietly taken advantage of by the person everyone assumes is protecting them, and I couldn't unknow it once I saw it in my own family. Some things you do simply because you are the kind of person who cannot walk past them. I think about that hallway a lot. About Quinn's voice saying I'd lost my right to be there, so certain of it, so practiced in that certainty after 10 years of assuming no one would ever check. The truth is, I never lost anything. I had simply stopped performing a role in a family that had already decided, decades earlier, who mattered and who didn't. And when the paperwork finally caught up to the truth, it turned out the woman standing at the door with nothing to prove, nothing to gain, and nothing left to lose was the one who had quietly told the truth all along. If there's a lesson in any of this, I think it's a quiet one, not the kind that fits neatly on a greeting card. It's that the people who leave loudly, who slam doors and cause scenes, are not always the ones who did something wrong. Sometimes the ones who stay, who smile at every holiday and manage every calendar, are doing the most damage of all, simply because no one ever thinks to look closely at the daughter everyone already trusts. If you were the one who left, the one who was written out, the one who stood at a door somewhere being told you didn't belong, I'd like to know. Would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed and fought for the truth to come out the way I did? This has been another story from Valira Payback. New videos every day.